Well, it says I am. Okay. Sorry about the delay, all. I was speaking for about 3 minutes, and I think it turned out I wasn't actually live. So I appreciate your patience. Thank you for tuning back in to Lunch Break Apostasies. Last week we were talking a little bit about Anglicanism, and we didn't receive any questions concerning that, which is fine. Of course, if you ever do have any questions about anything we study, I'm always more than happy to answer it to the best of my ability, and sometimes we'll even read it on here. As far as something that is good that you can see within the apostasy of Anglicanism, this one I had to dig for a little bit. It's not that there's so much besides the normal things that go along with apostasies that there is to criticize concerning it, but there's not a whole lot of good either. I can't, for example, look to the foundation. If I were to look to Lutheranism, there are things I like about Martin Luther. Now, there are a lot of things I really don't like about Martin Luther, and a lot of things that were apostate that he did, but there were things that are good about Luther. There's not much redeeming quality when it comes to a guy like King Henry VIII. That being said, I think if there is something that is good that you can sort of mesh with is the idea of identification within the church. What I mean by that is, do people feel like they are a Christian? Do they feel like they are part of this? Now, in the case of the Anglican Church, especially in England itself, that's not always the best. The proportions of people who identify as members of that church versus the ones who do that and are actually attending their services are dismal. You'll have congregations that have thousands of members on paper, but only have maybe 100 showing up on Sundays. But at least the identification as a Christian is a good thing. All right, let's go on to our topic for now. This is the Presbyterian Church. Presbyterianism is goes back to the Reformation, as everything we've been studying so far does. This one's a little bit different than some of the other ones. This one comes in about a generation later. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of those second generation reformers. John Calvin definitely comes to mind as far as second generation reformers go. But this is the first modern day continuous denomination. You can go all the way back to the Reformation and get to at least the one that comes from, I'm sorry, the second generation of Reformation. Um, you can look to Calvin and most churches that are called Reformed churches, for example, would fall under Calvin's traditions, and they're certainly Calvinist, but they're not really a denomination necessarily founded by Calvin. Unlike the guy we're going to be talking about today, and that is a fellow by the name of John Knox. Now, if the Anglican Church is the Church of England, by the way, the Presbyterian Church is the Church of Scotland. John Knox was born a peasant or on the coast of Scotland in 1514, and he was educated as a priest at St. Andrews. He was much like Martin Luther, once again a sign of these changing times. He was one of these people who managed to get educated beyond what is typically expected of that of a peasant. And much like Luther, he goes into the ministry because that is where that's sort of the open door. That's where somebody can gain a certain amount of power. I don't know much about Knox's father, to be honest, but my guess is he would be something like Luther's father, somebody who was able to make a decent amount of money even though he was a peasant. Um, he ends up being a very educated man, and although he does not receive a doctorate, he is just as educated as a doctor. Back in those days, the cost of actually obtaining the degree, and I mean just the title of doctor, was just about as much as the tuition itself. And so many people would opt not to go for the actual doctorate and just take the education. They still received a title, and those would usually be called Sir, which is why sometimes you'll read of Sir John Knox, and you might think, oh, so he wasn't a peasant. No, he was a peasant. It's just that that was an indication of his level of education. He ends up becoming a bodyguard for a famous priest. By the way, this is still in a very Catholic era at this point. Um, he ends up becoming a bodyguard for a very famous priest by the name of George Wishart. Now, Wishart was beloved in Scotland. He had some very reformist ideas, but he was beloved in Scotland. Part of it was because of his merciful reputation. It said that when the plague hit the city of Dundee, he would sit just by the outskirts and preach to the people of Dundee, and that was considered an act of great mercy. And he did seem to be a pretty compassionate guy overall, but he was a reformer, and so when he would be teaching in St. Andrews, um, he would be known to occasionally have these thoughts that were considered outside of the Catholic dogma. And a cardinal by the name of Beaton ended up sending spies to his classes. And when they reported back that he had been teaching these things, they put Wishart on a show trial. Beaton, by the way, already had this horrible reputation among the people of Scotland. He was one of these guys, much like before the Counter Reformation of the Catholic Church. Many of these people were only had their positions for financial reasons or for reasons of power. He was no exception. He was also one known to be a whoremonger, uh, particularly a problem when you're somebody who's supposed to have taken a vow of celibacy, and prideful. During these trials of Wishart, there was a visiting French cardinal, and it's said that the two of them ended up getting in a fight over who would get to enter into the courtroom first. And the fight apparently included they both had these these little scepters or whatever they were, some sort of signal of authority, and it was almost a sword fight with those. Just to give you an idea of the kind of guy Beaton was. But they end up burning Wishart at the stake. It was a show trial. It was just, you know, there was just this evil all about it. And as a result, the Protestants who were beginning to form around Wishart, well, they sort of fought back, and they ended up killing Beaton and taking over St. Andrews. And for a few years, St. Andrews became the center of Protestantism in Scotland, although Catholic forces would soon regain control over it. But it's during this time that Knox was asked to start preaching. He hadn't really thought much of I realize he had education in priesthood, but he really hadn't thought much of preaching up until this point. He was just Wishart's bodyguard. Um, but for a few years, he ends up being the preacher at St. Andrews, and he's beloved there. Unfortunately, Mary Geese, who is the Queen of Scotland at this point, she is French born and so very Catholic in her beliefs. She eventually allies with France and has France attack St. Andrews, and they're able to overtake it. And after the siege, most people who were involved with the taking of St. Andrews were executed. Knox himself ends up being condemned to be a galley slave, you know, somebody who's rowing all day, which at that time was basically considered another death sentence, just a slower, more torturous one. And so he had to spend some time being a galley slave. Eventually, however, he ends up being ransomed by the English. By the time he was done with this, it said that he was very emaciated looking. He was at the very edge of life. He becomes a court preacher to Edward VI of England. Remember, England is still very friendly to Protestantism at this point. Henry VIII has just recently died, and now his son, Edward the Sixth. Remember, I couldn't remember the son's name. It was Edward the Sixth. But Edward the Sixth also famously died very young. And when that happened, then Mary Tudor ends up taking over the throne. And you also might recall from last week that Mary Tudor was Catholic. She had to be if she wanted to hold on to her power and possibly to her head. She definitely had reason to consider herself Catholic. And because she is known as Bloody Mary for killing all these Protestants, as you can imagine, Calvin felt the need to flee from his position. He ends up fleeing over to Geneva, and you might recall that Geneva is where John Calvin spent most of his life. And he ends up studying at the feet of Calvin in Geneva. And as a result, when Knox is going to go back and sort of found his own church, it's going to be extremely Calvinist in nature. The Protestant churches, up until this point, have not been very Calvinist in nature. It's going to be pretty Calvinist here. He also learned certain aspects of political theory, and it is arguable that much political philosophy that even to this day is important in our governments can be traced back to John Calvin through John Knox. Um, Obviously, for our purposes, we're more concerned with the religious side of things. And he ends up returning to St. Andrews after the. Oh, let's see here. I can't remember what. I think Mary Tudor has died at this point, and Elizabeth the First of England is now in control of things. She, of course, is a Protestant, and so there's a little bit of an easier pathway towards Scotland. Um, it should be mentioned, by the way, that at this point, Scotland is considered part of the British Empire. It's not the United Kingdom just yet, but it's under British influence. And so he ends up returning to St. Andrews on the behest of Elizabeth I. You know what? No, I got that wrong. I'm sorry. Elizabeth I didn't have anything to do with that. Eventually, he's able to return to Scotland. Elizabeth I is going to pop up a little bit later, and it's going to be really important. But right now, when he returns, he has an intense rivalry with Mary, Queen of Scots. There were three Marys that were real problems for John Knox during his life. Mary Guise, who was the one who ends up invading St. Andrews and condemning him to be a galley slave. There is Mary Tudor, who ends up being the one causing him to flee from England. And now we have Mary, Queen of Scots, who is the daughter of Mary Guise, just to make things even more confusing. Mary Queen of Scots, despite her name, and although she was genetically half Scottish, she considered herself very French. Mary Guise, quickly after the siege of St. Andrews, she ended up having to go back to France, and that's where she ends up having her daughter, and so her daughter was raised pretty much in France. Um, when she ends up coming back to rule Scotland, keep in mind you're still under the English monarch here, but while she comes back to rule Scotland, she was popular among the nobility, but much like her mother, she is very pro-Catholic, although she's more subtle in her methods. That being said, most people were not willing to go against Mary except John Knox. He very famously, even while she was in the pews, would preach so strongly against the Catholicism of Mary, Queen of Scots. He eventually ends up writing this work, and it's one of his most infamous, called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regime of Women. And this is where he gets his reputation as an extreme sexist. Part of the thing, part of his belief is that it is unnatural for women to be rulers, and that's sort of the gist of the work. Now, some people try to defend the work, saying that the word monstrous here is not used how we would expect it to be. It's used in a more archaic form, and if it were going to be used in a modern form, then it might say the first blast of the trumpet against the strange regime of women, or maybe unnatural regime of women. All right, that's a little bit better, but not a whole lot, to be honest. He definitely had a problem with women in general. But this was actually pretty unfortunate because it was just at this time that Elizabeth I really comes into her power, and she ends up imprisoning, or I don't think it was imprisoning just yet, Mary Queen of Scots. I think she had her return over to London eventually when she was caught uh, in sedition. Eventually, Mary Queen of Scots would be beheaded. Um, but now that Elizabeth, who is Protestant, is in charge and would have been one of the greatest allies to John Knox, probably, she reads this and that they kind of have this tense, uneasy relationship. It's probably why there was always a difference between the Anglican and Presbyterian church. If it weren't for that, the Anglican church would probably look almost indistinguishable from the Presbyterians. He ends up reforming the Scottish church and really forming it into the Presbyterian church and under the ideals of Calvin. Remember, when it came to the Anglicans, there wasn't really an ideal of reform, which is why you had these Puritans who wanted it to be reformed under the ideal of the Reformation. But it looks extremely Catholic. Not so with the Presbyterians. These are the first ones that are really looking with what Calvin had in mind. Now, Presbyterianism itself, it was founded by John Knox to establish Protestantism in Scotland. By the way, Knox would pretty much spend the rest of his days preaching from St. Andrews. It comes from the word presbyteros, which is one of the words that we translate into elder, and so it is the church of the elders. There are a few creeds they take into consideration as authoritative. You have the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, which we've seen in many denominations so far. A unique one, however, is the Westminster Confession of Faith, which actually was not adopted until after the life of Knox. And I don't even think it was Presbyterians who wrote it, but they end up, even to this day, the Westminster Confession of Faith is extremely important in Presbyterianism. Unlike some of the other reformers we've seen so far, these are 5 point Calvinists. We have talked about that tulip. Remember the total hereditary depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Calvinists or traditional Presbyterians believe in all five of this and they're all in on it. Now, once again, I do have to emphasize the word traditional because a lot of times, especially in the modern day, denominations do not hold to their historic doctrines, but the conservatives among the Presbyterians are absolutely 5 point Calvinists. They also consider two sacraments. You have baptism, which includes infant baptism, and then you have consubstantial communion. Remember, we've had that transubstantial communion, the idea that the body is turning into a literal flesh, and that the bread is turning into literal flesh, and that the wine is turning into literal blood within the body of the person who's taking of it. This is not that. This is consubstantial. It is simultaneously the bread in the physical form, but it is also actually the body of Christ. That's Luther's idea of what it would be like. Um, a few other interesting quirks of the doctrines that you often see within Presbyterianism. Um, Many of them are big on no images of Christ. Now, that's something we often associate with Protestantism, but this is taken to a new extreme. Um, so you often see within Protestant churches, there's not going to be a picture of Jesus that is done in such a way that it is an icon, right? Our Catholic friends would maybe quibble with me about the level of worship that is given to these icons, but they definitely have religious significance. Whereas in most Protestant churches, if you see an image of Christ, it is usually purely educational. We in the Church of Christ are not Protestants, but we tend to go about the same way with this. I do think the Protestants generally have this right to use images of Christ only really in a educational fashion is pretty safe. Not so in the Presbyterian Church, though. You won't even find a Bible class. I'm sure if I were to go back into the children's Bible Sunday school, I could find a Bible that had plenty of pictures and plenty of pictures of Jesus, little cartoon illustrations. Not so in the Presbyterians. Many Presbyterians also hold to singing only from the Psalms. Um, so you're not going to have somebody who's Presbyterian who is a great songwriter because they're only going to sing from the songs. Now, they might be a great songwriter in the sense of they're putting music to the lyrics of these Psalms. And I mean the Bible book of Psalms, by the way. Um, but they're not going to be writing their own lyrics. And in the case of many Presbyterians, many of them believe that Sunday is the new Sabbath day, and so no work can be done on that. By the way, there's no biblical basis for any of these. As far as singing of the Psalms, in fact, you can go, well, here, don't take my word for it. Look at Ephesians here. Don't you love automatic lights? There we go. When you go over to a place like Ephesians 5:19, the Bible says, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, it does say to address one another in psalms, absolutely. By the way, this is talking about the commandments to sing, but does it limit it to the psalms only? No, there's also hymns, which isn't necessarily different than the psalms, and spiritual songs. We're supposed to be doing all of those things. The hierarchy within the Presbyterian Church. Of course, as the name indicates, churches are generally ruled over by an eldership, and it's usually a plurality of elders. However, there have been times, and very significant for us, where it was often just one elder. That's been a controversy historically within the Presbyterian Church. And then the top of the ladder are usually synods, and you have several independent synods of the Presbyterian Church. And unfortunately, I can't tell you a lot of them specifically, but there are so many divisions among the Presbyterians, and once again, it's kind of come back together as the ecumenical movement goes on. But especially back in the day, the Presbyterians were infamous for all the divisions among them. All right, so that's Presbyterianism. I thank you very much for your attention. And once again, you have any comments or questions, you let me know, and I really appreciate your interactions. Thank you so much, everybody. You have a good day.